careful what I say publicly. Thanks for coming. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, there we go. All right. Buenas tardes. Everybody can hear me? No, not too much of a Lesson. Right. Thank you so much for having me here on your stand, Suez. My name is Thomas van Waeyenberge. I am the head of the Brussels office in AQUAFED, which is the International Federation of Private Water Operators. Suez is one of the founding members of that organization. I will introduce myself, the organization, and then speak about why we feel it's important to be at the COP. Is it better? Is it better that way? All right, okay. I'm 43 years old, but I've spent 20 years of my life in water lobbying affairs, right? So I've gone from the very first Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002 in Johannesburg. I followed all the World Water Forums. I've been involved in all the United Nations conferences on, let's say, the development of the SDGs. And today, this is my first COP. So this is a first time for me to be in one of the COP meetings. But I'm privileged to be here representing about 400 companies in more than 40 countries worldwide, ranging from the very big multinationals like Suez, but also competitors of like Veolia, Acciona, Alliona, and so forth, to the very small family-run organizations that operate water on a daily basis in countries as diverse as the Philippines, Argentina, Indonesia, and so forth. AQUAFED today represents about 1 billion people that are served through water and sanitation services, which means that if you look at the whole planet, we have about 8 billion people. Out of those 8 billion people, 4 of them have access to a, let's say, sustainable, safe, well-managed water and sanitation services. Out of those 4, 3 are run by public operators and 1 by private operators. So those 1 billion people are represented through my organization. What do we stand for? We are a federation that is truly international, and we cooperate at the highest level of the United Nations system. We have ECOSOC status, which means that we get to be invited into the political negotiations, and we are one of the very few NGOs from the business side of things that are actually invited into the development agenda. Today I want to speak to you about the role that private operators and our members, ranging from the very big multinationals to smaller sized companies, can play in tackling issues related to climate change. We're all here because we know and we do realize that there's 3 themes related to this COP in Madrid, or Chile, if you want to call it that way, that are extremely important. Resilience of the systems that we already have in place, which means that we have to future-proof them for climate changes, multiple. The governance discussions that are related around that, which means that we have to make sure that we build a platform where people from the operator side of things, but also the consumers, the people that do not really understand what we're trying to do, get into the debate. And I'm talking about a whole range of actors, going from indigenous people to women to children, etc. And then the focus I want to make is about experience, performance, and delivering on an agenda. And for us, as a global trade federation with members on the ground, I was working for many years as an operator, but I've been working many more years as a lobbyist, and sometimes that's called negative, but it's very important to know that people who come from the field also have something to say. Delivering on an agenda and helping governments understanding what they need to do to deliver on an agenda is crucial. I don't have a presentation, but I just have to go through my mind once in a while. One of the key points that we have to realize in this COP25 is that climate change is hurting or impacting the poorest in the most disproportionate way. If you look at urbanization, the impacts of climate change, drought, but also, and more importantly, floods, the people that do not have access to sustainable water and wastewater services at this point in time are disproportionately affected. For us as operators, or my members as operators, this is a huge challenge. And let me explain that to you. Our members are deliverers of public services through contracts with local authorities. So they take over a service for a certain time. It can be 2 years, 5 years, 20 years. It can be all kinds of contracts. But they try to deliver the service for the best way possible through their contracts. And they deliver it to everybody independently. So they deliver a human right, they deliver a public service, but they operate in an institutional framework that is set by governments. In the context of climate change and human rights, we have to realize that in the next period, up till 2030 or 2050, those constraints will impact our members' activities, but also the way that governments deliver public services. And there is actually no difference between the constraints that impact private or public operators. The constraints are there. The demographic, the urbanization, the climate change impacts mean that we're going to have to look to the poorest first. And delivering services to the urban poor of the next 5, 10, 15 years means that we're going to have to rethink our models of service delivery. We're going to have to look at all types of activities that make sure that we go to the poorest first. This is a human rights imperative. Private operators have subscribed to this. But it means that we're going to make sure that our systems are developed in a way that addresses the need of the populations that need it most first, and that we're going to make sure that they have the services that they want. The poorest are going to be impacted firstly and mostly by the impacts of climate change, and this means that we're going to have to need a step change in the way we develop our systems. The second big challenge that we face, and that is compounding the impacts, is urbanization. I would like to invite the audience to raise the hand and say, give me the 5 fastest growing cities in the world, or the largest population concentrations in Africa or in China. Probably you would not be able to give them to me, because we still believe that Mexico City or Paris or maybe London is some of the cities where the challenges are, but it's not true. This brings us to the question of how do we deal with rapidly urbanizing environments because of people fleeing the countrysides, flocking to the cities, and governments, local authorities needing to put into place systems that are not there right now. These are very costly, and so we cannot afford to waste any type of money in terms of inefficiency. What we stand for with our members is solution bringers. Our members go to the big megalopolises in Africa and India that we don't know the name of, and we try to make sure that innovative solutions are put into the ground. Concretely, what we're thinking about in terms of climate-proofing the agenda, in terms of what our members can do and what other public utilities should be doing, is looking at the feedback loops that we have in the environment. Climate change goes through many, many ways. One of the key things that we have to realize is that wastewater management has an incredible impact on the resources and on the health attitudes that we have in many, many regions of the world. This is part of what we call the circular economy. It's linked to treating waste as a resource, but it's also about the upstream and downstream dynamics of what we call the governance discussion. It's a crucial example of where local governments can give an operator a clear mandate to actually be more progressive in dealing with wastewater services. Once you get water into a system, you get more wastewater. And so what we need to do is focus more on those waste outputs and turn them into something that we can recycle into something positive. We also know that 1/3 of the Earth's population lives in very vulnerable areas, coastal areas, subject to flooding, to saline intrusion, and through also concentration. This is where the mega metropolises of the world are. And so our members and, let's say, utilities worldwide have a huge responsibility to beef up stormwater management and flood protection in those areas. This requires also a change in thinking between the short term and the long term. If you talk about circular economy, but also climate-proofing your infrastructure, it means that as a community, as a local authority, you have to accept that you're going to have to go beyond this generation, but look at the next generation, which means thinking about how do you invest in 25-year cycles, how do you contract out certain services or keep it in-house, it doesn't matter, but still keep the long-term perspective. As partners of local authorities, this is essential that we can show that we can climate-proof our present infrastructure. I come from Belgium, and in Belgium we have public management. I'm not saying it's good or bad. It works. I pay my tariffs. They're not higher or lower than any other kind of country. But what we do know is that the infrastructure that we have underground, be it for water, let's say distribution, or for wastewater disposal, is aging. And so if you look at the numbers globally, and in terms of reaching the 2030 goals, World Bank calculations have put it at 150 billion euros per year to get safely managed water infrastructure. But that is not taking into account what is already in the ground. And in many of the capitals of the world, right now, as we speak, all of that infrastructure is aging. In Brussels, we have sinkholes. You've seen it in London, you've seen it in Berlin, you've seen it in New York, where you see huge holes because of the fact that this infrastructure is already 50, 60, 70, 80, 90 years old. And so our message through the climate discussions is that, yes, we do have to look at infrastructure to be built for the most poorest populations in the world that are disproportionately affected. But let us not also forget, neither forget the infrastructure in the cities that we already have. And this is a huge challenge. On constrained budgets in times of economical crisis, it's very difficult to explain to citizens why you need to invest money in this type of infrastructure. Our companies can do it, but I think it is a matter of governance. The foremost discussion that we need to have is that water is climate change, and vice versa. The driver of the climate change impacts that we're going to be facing, whether it's in the north or the south, poor or rich, is going to come through floods, droughts, but also through flash floods, something that in our cities, for example, in Europe, we've never seen. Some cities have built sewerage systems that are capable of dealing with normal situations, but when you get the flash floods linked to a disproportionate heating of the Mediterranean, dumping in Poland, you get big problems. We believe that in the discussion around the COP25, all voices should be heard. There's often an antagonistic debate between whether public or private can play a better role, whether private sector should be involved. Evidence has shown over the last 15 years that all models can work. What we really need to achieve is a level playing field, firstly. Secondly, a governance debate that involves all stakeholders and that explains why a policy or a government chooses one solution or not. We've seen very good public operators operating, for example, in Sao Paulo, in Sabespi. They're quoted on the stock market. They're doing a great job. We've seen excellent operators doing fantastic things, including nowadays in developing markets. But what we do believe is that there needs to be a dialogue, a level playing field, a discussion, open-minded on where we want to go, and a connection to the very long term. One of the challenges that we face in water and wastewater services delivery is the disconnect between the political cycle, which is very short, up to 3, 4, 5 years, depending on, let's say, the political situation that you're in, and then the investment needs. And we all know that it's reaching to 2030, 2050, but even 21st century. And to be able to adequate those decisions needs a sound debate. It's a debate that needs to be had in terms of key performance indicators, transparent benchmarking, utilities from various parts of certain regions reaching out to each other and saying, okay, this is my price, but I deliver this is my investment level, this is what my authority wants me to do, and step away from an ideological view of looking at things. I come back to the point that I made in the beginning. We are 8 billion people on this planet. Half of them do not have access to sustainably run water and wastewater services, which means that they rely on buying water from a vendor, getting it themselves with a donkey, women carrying water, or even children being deprived of scholarization. It's not about public versus private, but it's about doing our jobs better. And the utilities of today that are present here are part of that discussion. We should be helping, and this is actually very crucial in this COP25 debate, we should be helping our policymakers to raise the profile of water higher on the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. We all know about SDG 6, but what we do not know or realize enough is the interlinkages between the SDGs. And yes, you would argue that there is competition between putting more money in education or putting more money in energy, but water and sanitation services undermine all those efforts in the first place. To conclude, I would like to make a point about the practicalities. Yes, there is more comprehension of what the private sector can do in terms of climate proofing, resilience, infrastructure building, etc. But I wouldn't be too optimistic. We're still lagging behind, and we are not only going to need the private sector, but we're going to need the public sector as well, and we're going to need, let's say, models that are sustainable in the very long run. And these models are going to integrate, let's say, the COP25 or COP26 commitments that governments make, but more importantly, they're going to be focused also on a human rights dimension. Once we realize that we are delivering on a human right to water and sanitation, and once we prioritize it in public budgets, we will make sure that our projects are going to take off, be more sustainable in the long run. There is absolute need to link the climate change just dimensions with the human rights tracker. What I see in terms of development of projects nowadays is that, for example, the investors who are investing in sustainable projects that are delivered by public or private are increasingly looking at water footprints. You've heard about energy footprints, but what we're increasingly hearing about is human rights footprints and water footprints. And some of these funds are no longer spending money on projects that cannot calculate the water footprints, the positive footprints, the impacts. What do you realize in terms, what are your investments doing in terms of bringing the human right to water and sanitation to people, delivering it? And our message for the COP, let's say to conclude, is that we quite know and we quite understand how governments should prioritize this. What we really need to see right now is action by governments, whether it is in prioritizing money spent on national budgets for water and sanitation services, prioritizing the recognition and the implementation of the human rights to water and sanitation. And yes, it will go to the expense of some other things, but we all know that investing $1 in water yields $8 in GDP. So to conclude on that, I believe that the private sector can play a major role under the right circumstances. We do not advocate for private sector participation in all countries everywhere, but we do believe that in terms of being a tool, an appropriate tool, it can really make a difference. Thank you very much.